The lantern hisses. Wind threads through the warped boards like a thin blade, carrying the dry sting of dust and old hay. Somewhere close, leather creaks, a boot scuffs, the kind of sound a man makes when he isn't sure he wants to be seen. She stands under the jaundiced light, wrists rubbed raw by rope, Evelyn Hart, dress torn at the hem, chin lifted as if that's the only piece of herself she still owns. Around her, men breathe through whiskey teeth. The floor is packed earth, hammered flat by hooves and hard bargains. Smoke hangs low, sweet, with kerosene and the ghost of cattle. A voice cuts the hush, rough as a rasp on iron. Guaranteed your money back if she doesn't satisfy. The dealer grins, laughter spills, quick and mean, then dies. It's winter cold in here, but shame burns like a brand. Evelyn stares past the crowd, past the lantern, past this night. What she sees there, no one knows. Not yet, but you can feel it, the small tremor before a fence post gives, the tick of a colt before the hammer falls. Somewhere near the back wall, a man shifts his weight and looks up. If these old Western echoes touch something quiet in you, stay a while longer. Tap subscribe so you won't miss the next time we sit by the fire and carry on, because before this light goes out, a purchase made in silence will change the shape of 2 lives. Under the weak flame of an oil lamp, the night in Silver Creek breathed like something half alive. The town had already shut itself behind warped doors and sagging shutters, but behind the saloon, the one with the faded sign and the cracked piano inside, light leaked from the old horse barn. A thin wind carried the smell of kerosene, sweat, and fear. Inside, boots scraped the dirt floor, spurs clicked, men laughed, rough and short, like wolves snapping at bones. At the far end, under a single hook lantern, she stood. Her dress, once blue, now the color of old ash, rope cut into her wrists, skin rubbed raw. Evelyn Hart, though no one here cared for the name, kept her head high. Not proud, just unwilling to let it fall. Every breath she drew was shallow, trembling at the edge of collapse. Still, her eyes stayed level. Lyle Jennings, the trader, leaned on the rail with a grin that never touched his eyes. His voice rasped through the room. Guaranteed satisfaction, gentlemen, or your money back? He said it like a joke, like this was some game of cards instead of flesh and blood. A few men chuckled, others spat, coins clinked. Somewhere in the crowd, a bottle hit the ground and rolled. No one spoke to her. No one looked long enough to see the small tremor at her shoulder, or how she tried to steady herself against the post. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and something colder shame that didn't belong to her, yet clung all the same. Outside, wind moved through the broken slats, moaning soft. A horse snorted from a nearby stall. For a moment, the noise drowned out the men. Evelyn turned her face slightly toward it, as if listening for a voice from somewhere far off. Maybe she imagined the open plains, or the rustle of cottonwoods by a river. Anything that wasn't this. Jennings tapped his boot heel on the floor. "She's worth the price," he said, waving a hand toward her. "Strong enough. Still got some fight left." The laughter came again, louder this time. It filled the space like a foul tide. Evelyn didn't flinch. Her lips parted, not in words, but in breath, a slow, measured thing that sounded almost like prayer. The rope strained against her wrists as she shifted her weight. A single lock of hair fell across her cheek, catching the lamplight before sliding away into shadow. In that moment, Something changed in the air. Not enough for the men to notice, but enough that time seemed to hesitate. The lamp hissed, the flame bending low, and for a heartbeat, everything held still: the laughter, the smoke, the restless hooves, outside. Then came the sound of boots again, but slower, heavier. Someone was moving near the back wall. No one turned. They were too busy haggling over prices and whiskey. Evelyn heard it, though. The steps had weight to them, not drunken, not eager, measured. Jennings raised his voice. "Who'll start the bidding?" His tone bounced off the rafters, eager and mean. "Don't be shy. Boys, she's a fine deal, guaranteed." No answer came. Only the wind, finding its way through a crack, blew the smoke sideways. Evelyn's gaze drifted toward the shadow in the corner, the place where the lamplight couldn't quite reach. There was a shape there, a man. Maybe broad shoulders, still as the posts holding the roof. For a flicker, the two met eyes. She couldn't see his face. Not really. But she caught the outline, the tilt of his hat, the faint glint of metal at his belt. He didn't move, just watched. It wasn't the look of a buyer, nor of pity. It was something else. Quiet. Waited. Jennings slammed his palm on the rail. "Come on. Now don't make me think y'all turned righteous." The crowd stirred. Coins jangled again. Someone muttered a number. Another laughed. Evelyn looked down. Dust shifted under her bare feet. The floor was cold, the earth packed tight. But she felt the smallest pulse of heat through it, maybe from the horses, maybe from her own stubborn will refusing to die. The trader reached out, caught her chin between two fingers. "Smile for them, sweetheart." He sneered. The touch made her skin crawl. But she didn't move. Her eyes stayed on him, unblinking, until he pulled back with a curse. Silence spread. Even the laughter dulled. The men weren't sure why. But something about her gaze made them uneasy, like watching a storm build beyond the horizon. Jennings forced a laugh to break it. Feisty. That's what makes her worth it. From the corner, the man in the hat shifted again. A coin slipped from his fingers and hit the dirt with a soft, dull sound. The room turned toward it, just for a second. Evelyn did too, and in that second, she saw his hand rough, scarred, but steady. He wasn't reaching for his wallet, just letting the coin rest there in the dust, as though marking the moment. Jennings barked a laugh. "Well, now, we've got interest." But the man didn't answer, didn't move. The coin stayed where it fell, catching the faintest spark of lamplight before sinking back into shadow. Evelyn blinked. Something inside her, a long frozen place, shifted. Barely. A feeling she couldn't name. Not hope. Not yet. Just the quiet sense that someone, somewhere in this room, had seen her as more than a thing to be sold. Outside, a coyote called from the ridge. The sound threaded through the cracks in the wood, wild and lonesome. Jennings cursed at the noise and went back to counting money. The men followed, their laughter returning like wind through dead grass. But for Evelyn, that cry stayed. It echoed beneath her ribs, reminding her of open land and cold stars of nights when the world still felt wide. The lamp sputtered once more, throwing long, trembling shadows across the floor. The man in the corner didn't move again. Not yet. Evelyn closed her eyes for a breath. And when she opened them, the world seemed just a little different. The same walls, the same rope, the same cruel laughter, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the way the light caught the dust, or the way the wind slipped through the cracks. whispering of distance and escape. Or maybe it was that coin, lying quiet in the dirt between them, gleaming faintly. Like the beginning of a promise no one had spoken aloud. The lantern swayed, its light breathing, slow against the timber walls. The smoke hung low, curling between beams like a restless spirit. In the far corner, where the glow gave up and shadows began to swallow the dust, a man stood still, hat pulled low, coat frayed at the cuffs, boots caked with the pale dirt of too many miles. Grant Holloway, he hadn't meant to stop here. He'd left his wagon by the blacksmith's, waiting on a box of nails and a repaired horseshoe. The saloon was just a shortcut, a place to warm his hands for a minute before heading back to his camp beyond the ridge. But the laughter coming from the barn had stopped him cold. It wasn't joy. It was the kind of sound men make when they've forgotten they were ever boys. Now he stood there, one hand resting on the post behind him, eyes half hidden under the brim. The lamplight reached just enough to carve the line of his jaw, the thin scar that cut across his cheek like a reminder. It wasn't the kind of scar time could soften. He watched the woman, watched her wrists twist under the rope, watched the way she refused to bow her head. Something in that quiet defiance pressed against a part of him he thought had died years ago. A memory flickered bright, sharp, then gone. A boy's scream, the smell of gunpowder, the echo of a name lost to the wind. He took a slow breath, the kind meant to hold the ache down. The barn smelled of old hay and sweat, of whiskey spilled on dirt. The men near the front leaned over each other, coins ready, their talk rough and careless. He'd seen this kind of thing before, in places without names. War did that to men, turned them cruel in small, thoughtless ways. Grant shifted his weight. The floorboards creaked under his heel. A few heads turned, but lost interest just as quick. He wasn't worth noticing, just another drifter, lean and tired, coat smelling of dust and distance. He liked it that way. But then the trader's hand caught the woman's chin. The sound of her breath, sharp, contained, hit him harder than any shout. He felt his jaw tighten. His fingers brushed against the edge of his belt, where a pistol once hung. Not tonight, he thought. Not again. He wasn't that man anymore. Still, he couldn't look away. The lamplight trembled. A draft slipped through the cracks, carrying the cold of the desert night. Evelyn's hair lifted slightly, brushing against her cheek. She looked toward him just for a second. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't fear either. It was something deeper, quieter. Recognition, maybe, like two ghosts meeting in the dark, surprised to find the other still here. Grant swallowed, his throat dry as chalk. The scar on his cheek itched the way it always did when memory crawled close. He saw his brother again, small hands reaching out, dust flying as hooves thundered past. The world had gone red that day. He hadn't been fast enough, not strong enough. The guilt had followed him west. Sitting on his shoulders, like a second shadow, the trader's voice broke through, loud and sure. Who'll start? He slapped the rail. Laughter answered. Money changed hands. The sound was hollow, empty as a church bell in a ghost town. Grant's gaze dropped to the dirt between his boots. That coin he'd dropped earlier glinted faintly, half buried in the straw. He stared at it a long time. Funny thing, how one piece of metal could mean nothing one day, and everything the next. He didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. The men's voices blurred into a low hum, the kind of noise you could forget if you wanted to. But beneath it, he heard her breathing, Shallow, steady, like she was trying not to let the world hear how tired she was. For a moment, he closed his eyes, let the sounds bleed together, the creak of rope, the shift of boots, the flick of a match. He could almost hear another night, long ago, another cry for help that never reached him in time. The scar burned again, hot under the skin. Grant opened his eyes. The room looked the same, but it wasn't. He realized his hands were no longer at his sides. One had curled into a fist. The other had reached for his pocket, where he kept what was left of his pay from the last job mending fences out near Red Mesa. He rubbed the coins together. Small sound, almost nothing, but it steadied him, reminded him he was still here, still breathing. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it wasn't. Jennings was still talking, voice slick with liquor. She's worth double to the right man. You won't find better in Silver Creek. The crowd chuckled, but Grant heard the tremor beneath the dealer's confidence, the greed, the rot. He looked at the woman again. Evelyn. He didn't know her name yet, but it hung in the air somehow, waiting to be spoken. The lamplight caught her eyes, and for the first time, he saw what was in them. Not just fear, fury, the kind that comes from living too long on the edge of survival. Something inside him settled then. The noise faded. The laughter dulled. All that was left was the sound of his own heartbeat, slow and certain. He didn't know why he'd stopped in Silver Creek tonight. Maybe he'd been heading here all along. Maybe some things have a way of finding you no matter how far west you ride. A man near the front raised his hand, tossed a few coins toward the dealer. The clink of metal against wood snapped Grant back. He felt the muscles in his jaw tighten again. His breath came slower, deeper. The decision hadn't formed yet, but it was already there, quiet, waiting. Outside, the wind pushed harder against the walls. The lantern flame stretched thin. Dust danced through the air, tiny sparks in the dim light. Grant shifted again, straightened his shoulders. His fingers brushed the brim of his hat. No one noticed, not yet. He stared at the coin on the floor, the one half covered in straw, then at the woman, standing tall despite the rope and the filth and the stairs. Something about the way she didn't break, that was it. That was the reason. His chest rose once, slow, then fell. He knew what he was about to do would change everything. Maybe it wouldn't save her. Maybe it wouldn't save him either. But for the first time in years, the silence inside him began to crack. He exhaled, quiet as a prayer. The wind outside stilled, and in the faint, flickering light, Grant Holloway reached into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing cold silver, counting what was left of his luck. The room had gone still in a way only fear or truth could make it. The laughter that once filled the air thinned out, like smoke losing its strength. The lantern flame bent low, stretched long across the floorboards. Then it was just his voice, quiet, rough from disuse, cutting through the silence. "I'll buy her." No one breathed. Even the horses beyond the stalls seemed to listen. Grant's words hung there, simple and solid, like a nail driven straight into old wood. Jennings blinked first, then laughed a dry, barking sound that didn't quite reach his throat. "You hell, son. She's worth more than that coat you're wearing." Grant didn't move. He only reached into his pocket, thumb brushing the cold silver coins inside. "Name your price," he said, tone low but steady. The dealer tilted his head, studying him. He saw the dust on Grant's boots, the worn leather, the kind of man who carried the smell of distance. Then Jennings' grin widened. "Double," he said. "Let's see how sure you are." Grant nodded once. No hesitation. He emptied his pockets onto the rail, coins falling soft but clear. The sound echoed in that barn, sharper than gunfire. One man snorted, "He's lost his damn mind." Another muttered, "Ain't worth it." But no one stopped him. No one stepped forward. Jennings scooped up the money, counting with slow, greedy fingers. "All right then. Soldier boy," he said, voice slick with amusement. "She's yours." Grant didn't answer. He walked past the man, his boots leaving faint prints in the dust. The air between them was thick with smoke and the faint iron tang of fear. When he reached the post, he stopped. Evelyn's eyes lifted to his. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. He pulled the knife from his belt blade, dull, handle cracked from years of use. The rope gave way with a soft, tired sound. Her wrists dropped free. She didn't move at first, like her body didn't quite believe it was allowed to. Then she drew in a small breath, shallow, broken, but her own. Grant held out his hand, not his command, not his comfort, just there, open. She stared at it for a long moment, then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. Her skin was cold, and his palm was rough enough to catch on the frayed edge of her sleeve. The contact was brief, careful two strangers caught in the same quiet storm. Jennings' voice came again, somewhere behind them. Pleasure, doing business. His tone dripped mockery, but Grant didn't turn. He didn't need to. The men parted as he led her through them, their boots scuffing against the dirt, their stares heavy and mean. No one spoke. They just watched. Some with confusion, some with a sneer, but most with the uneasy silence of men seeing something they couldn't quite name. Outside, the night air hit sharp and cold. The moon was a thin sliver, pale against the empty sky. Wind tugged at the edges of Grant's coat. Evelyn stumbled once on the step, and he steadied her by the elbow lightly, nothing more. For the first time since the war, he felt the tremor in his hand, not from fear, from the weight of what he'd just done. He hadn't thought it through, didn't plan to. He just couldn't stand still anymore. Behind them, laughter rose again, but thinner, this time forced, uneasy. The sound faded as they crossed the yard, swallowed by the cold. The saloon's windows glowed faintly across the way, voices spilling out with the warmth. Somewhere inside, someone struck a piano key and missed. It rang out, lonely, hanging in the night. Grant stopped near the hitching post, the lamplight brushing the side of his face. Evelyn stood beside him, holding her wrists close to her chest. The rope burns had begun to darken, but she said nothing. Neither did he. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind that comes when words are too small for what has just changed. Grant reached into his coat, pulled out a thin piece of cloth, an old kerchief, frayed at the corners. He handed it to her. "Wrap it," he said softly. Her fingers hesitated, then took it. The fabric was rough, smelled faintly of smoke and pine. She tied it around her wrists, with care, not looking at him. He turned toward the dark road leading out of town. "My wagon's at the edge," he said, voice low. "You can ride if you want." For a long moment, she didn't move. Her gaze lingered on the barn, on the glow of the oil lamp still burning inside. Then she looked back at him, eyes unreadable. "All right," she whispered. Grant nodded once. That was enough. They walked past the last building, where a broken sign swung on one hinge, squealing with each gust of wind. The dirt road stretched ahead, endless, colorless, soft underfoot. Evelyn followed a few steps behind, her breath visible in the chill. Each sound the crunch of gravel, the creak of leather, the distant call of a night bird seemed louder out here. Grant didn't look back, but he slowed his stride just enough for her to keep pace. When they reached the wagon, he climbed onto the driver's bench and checked the reins. The horse shifted, stamping against the cold. He gestured toward the back. "Blankets there," he said. She climbed up without a word. The boards creaked beneath her weight. She sat with her arms folded, staring at the town lights fading behind them. Grant clicked his tongue, and the horse began to move. The wheels groaned. The night closed in. For miles, they said nothing. Only the wind spoke, brushing through the dry grass, whispering things neither of them could name. At one point, Evelyn pulled the blanket around her shoulders, then looked toward the man driving. His outline was dark against the faint starlight, shoulders broad, still as stone. She wanted to ask why he'd done it, but the words never came. Something in his silence told her it wasn't a question that needed asking yet. Grant kept his eyes on the horizon. Each turn of the wheel felt like a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The air smelled cleaner out here, or maybe it was just less human. He thought of the coin left behind in that barn, the one half buried in straw. Maybe it was still there, glinting faintly under the lantern light. A small, forgotten marker of the moment everything shifted. He didn't regret leaving it. Some things were better left behind. The wind softened as they crossed the ridge. The stars above widened, cold and endless. Evelyn leaned her head back against the wagon's side, eyes half closed. Grant glanced over, once, just once. She wasn't asleep, but her face had lost the tightness it wore before. In the dim light, he saw her lips move, not words, just breath. He turned his gaze forward again. The night was long, the road longer, but for the first time in years, he didn't mind the distance. Behind them, the town of Silver Creek shrank to a dull glow. Ahead, the land opened wide and quiet, waiting, and somewhere in that quiet, something small, fragile, almost invisible began to stir. Not hope, not yet, but close. The night had no color left in it, just cold air and the sound of hooves pressing into the hard dirt road. The wagon creaked with each mile, its wooden wheels whispering against the stones. Somewhere above, the moon hung thin and tired, floating between slow-drifting clouds. Grant sat at the reins, shoulders hunched inside his worn coat. The brim of his hat threw his face in shadow. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the edge of town. Every now and then, he'd clear his throat, like maybe a word wanted to come, but couldn't find its way out. Behind him, Evelyn sat on a folded blanket near the wagon's backboard, knees drawn close. The road jolted beneath her. Each bump sent small shocks through her bruised arms, but she didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the narrow line of horizon, what little she could see between the canvas edges. It looked endless, empty. She couldn't tell if they'd been riding an hour or all night. The stars had started to fade behind a low mist. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried once, long and thin, before the silence took over again. The air smelled like dust and pine sap, cold enough to bite through the thin cloth of her dress. She pulled the blanket tighter, breathing into her palms for warmth. Grant's voice came at last, rough from the quiet. Few more miles. Evelyn looked up, though he hadn't turned. His tone wasn't sharp, wasn't soft either. It was the voice of someone who didn't expect an answer. The horse stumbled, caught itself. Grant gave a light tug on the reins, murmured something low and steady words, meant for animals, not people. The rhythm of hooves steadied again. She studied the back of him, the way he moved, measured and sure, like a man who'd spent too long letting silence be enough. His coat looked older than he did. There were places at the seams where the thread had given up, but it still held together. Same as he did. Every time she closed her eyes, the barn came back the light, the smell, the sound of laughter turning mean. Then the sudden stillness when he spoke. She didn't understand why he'd done it. Men didn't buy what they didn't want to use or own, at least not the kind of men she'd met. The wagon climbed slowly toward the ridge. Rocks shifted under the wheels. The wind changed direction, carrying a faint scent of cedar. Grant tilted his head slightly, listening. Storm coming. He said. Evelyn didn't answer. She wasn't sure if it was meant for her. They rode on, somewhere behind them. The faintest glow still marked the town Silver Creek, with its cheap whiskey and cheaper souls. She watched it shrink into nothing, swallowed by the black stretch of land. For the first time in years, no one knew where she was. It should have been a comfort. It wasn't. Her fingers traced the edge of the kerchief around her wrist, the one he'd given her. The cloth was coarse, but it held warmth. She wondered how long it had been, his how many miles it had seen before finding its way to her. Grant shifted on the bench, pulling his coat tighter. He didn't look back, but he knew she was awake. He could hear her breathing, uneven but quiet. He thought of saying something, anything but every word that came to mind felt too heavy to lift. He'd never been good with words. Back in the army, he'd learned that silence could save a man's life. You stay still. You listen. You wait. Sometimes that was all there was to do. But tonight, the silence didn't feel like protection. It felt like distance. He glanced up at the sky. The clouds were thickening. The first drop of rain hit the brim of his hat, rolled down the edge. He breathed out. Slow. We'll reach the ridge before it breaks, he said, mostly to himself. Evelyn drew her knees tighter. And after, the question hung there, soft, unsure. Grant didn't answer right away. The reins creaked in his hands. After, he said finally, we rest. Just that, no promise, no comfort, but it was something. They fell back into quiet. The wagon rattled on, rocking with the rhythm of the horse's stride. When the rain came, it wasn't hard, just a fine drizzle, enough to shine the road and darken the wood. The scent of wet dust rose into the air. Evelyn tilted her face toward it, eyes closed, letting the cool touch of it wash away the taste of fear still clinging to her mouth. Grant kept driving. Each droplet tapped against the brim of his hat, a slow percussion. The horse's breath came out in thin clouds. He leaned forward once to check the trail, then back again, settling into the long, slow pull of the climb. After a while, he spoke again. There's a stream ahead. We'll water the horse. Evelyn nodded, though he couldn't see. Her voice was small. All right. When they reached the stream, the sound of water broke the stillness like a song that had been waiting to be heard. Grant climbed down first, boots sinking into the wet earth. He loosened the reins, let the horse drink. The animal's muzzle broke the surface, ripples spreading out in the moonlight. Evelyn climbed down next, her legs unsteady from the hours of sitting. The cold hit her sharp, but she didn't complain. She crouched near the stream, cupping water in her palms. It was icy enough to make her fingers ache, but she drank anyway. Grant watched her for a moment, then looked away. Something about the way she moved, careful, quiet, reminded him of things he'd forgotten. The way his sister used to wash clothes by the river before the raid, before everything burned. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, pushing the memory down. When she stood, her dress clung to her knees, soaked from the splash. Grant tossed her his coat. "Take it," he said. She hesitated. "You'll need it." "I've got the firebox," he said. "Take it." She took it, draped it over her shoulders. The smell of him tobacco, leather, faint pine wrapped around her, like something both foreign and oddly safe. They got back on the wagon. Neither spoke. The road ahead curved upward, the land turning darker, steeper. Grant felt the weight of the coat missing from his shoulders, but he didn't regret it. Some warmth, he figured, wasn't meant to be kept. They drove until the first light of dawn began to show behind the hills. Pale gold brushed the edges of the clouds. The rain had stopped. Grant slowed the horse. The ridge rose, a head-black ridge. They called it, home to no one but wind and coyotes. Beyond it, valleys opened wide and silent. He exhaled, steady, almost there. Evelyn stirred behind him, her voice low, fragile as breath. "Where's there?" He didn't turn. Just a place to stop. The horse pulled forward again, hooves crunching over gravel. The wind had softened now. The desert smelled of sage and wet dust. The sun, still hidden, sent a thin warmth through the clouds. Evelyn rested her head against the wagon's frame. Her eyelids grew heavy. For the first time since the barn, she didn't dream of escape or fear. Just the sound of hooves and the faint rhythm of a man who hadn't spoken more than a handful of words, but whose silence somehow didn't feel like threat. As the wagon crested the ridge, the first full ray of sunlight broke across the land, lighting the wet stones and the dust hanging in the air. Grant glanced toward it, eyes narrowing against the glare. He didn't smile, but his shoulders eased just a little. The road bent downward from there, leading toward a valley wrapped in mist. He flicked the reins lightly. The horse began its slow descent, and the sound of the wheels echoed against the hills, steady, patient, the sound of two lost souls carried by the same road, toward something neither could yet name. The horse slowed before the valley opened wide, breath steaming in the dawn air. The world there was muted colors, softened by dust and the pale light of morning. Beyond a cluster of stunted pines stood a small cabin, hunched against the wind like an old man guarding what little was left. The boards had gone gray with time. The roof sagged on one side. Smoke hadn't come from the chimney in days. Yet, somehow, it still looked like it belonged to the land, as if it had grown from the soil itself. Grant pulled the reins, the wagon groaning to a stop. The horse tossed its head, eager to rest. He climbed down first, his boots sinking into the soft dirt, then reached for the lantern under the seat. It was nearly spent, wick short and blackened, but it still offered a faint glow as he lifted it toward the porch. "Down you go," he said quietly, not looking back. Evelyn climbed out slowly, her feet stiff from the long ride. She stood beside the wagon, holding the blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes followed the line of the cabin's roof, then drifted to the hills that folded around the valley like a cradle too wide for comfort. The silence here was different, thicker, heavier. Grant pushed the cabin door open. The hinges gave a tired groan. Inside smelled of pine dust and smoke, long gone cold. He set the lantern on the table, its small light trembling against the walls. There wasn't much to see. One bed, narrow and rough-hewn, a small stove near the corner. A Winchester leaned beside the door, barrel polished from use. He turned to her. "Sit," he said, motioning toward the chair by the table. Evelyn stepped inside, her boots brushing against the wood. The floor creaked beneath her, answering with its own kind of weariness. She lowered herself onto the chair, keeping her hands folded tight. Grant crossed to the shelf, took down a tin cup, and poured water from the jug beside the stove. "Drink," he said. The word carried no tone, no demand, just the weight of something practical. She took the cup, felt the chill of it against her palms. The water was clean, colder than she expected. It burned down her throat in a way that reminded her she was still alive. He turned toward the stove, struck a match, and lit the small pile of wood already waiting. The flame caught quick, snapping like it had been, hungry for years. Evelyn watched his hands. They were steady, careful. Everything he did had a quiet rhythm, like he'd been doing it alone for too long. When the fire began to hold, he stood and pulled his coat from the back of the chair. "There's the bed," he said, nodding toward it. "You should rest." She looked at him, unsure. "And you?" He shook his head. "Floor's fine." Something flickered in her eyes, a mix of confusion and caution. Men didn't usually offer kindness without cost. She wanted to speak, to question it, but the words tangled. Instead, she nodded, slow and uncertain. He pulled a folded blanket from a chest near the wall, spread it on the floor beside the stove. Then he sat down, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire. The sound of the wood cracking filled the room. Outside, wind moved through the trees, whispering against the walls. Evelyn set the empty cup on the table, then moved toward the bed. She sat on the edge of it, staring at the flame. She didn't lie down at first. Sleep was something her body didn't remember how to trust. She watched him instead, the way his shoulders curved slightly forward, how the firelight flickered across his face, tracing the scar along his cheek. He looked carved from something old oak or memory. He didn't look up, but after a while, he spoke. "You can rest easy. Nobody'll come here." Her voice came small. "How can you be sure I've been here near 3 years?" he said. "Ain't had a visitor yet." That should have been comforting. Somehow, it wasn't. It sounded more like a confession. A log shifted in the fire. The light wavered across the ceiling, drawing patterns that looked almost like moving water. Evelyn lay back slowly, boots still on, her hand resting over the blanket's edge. The bed creaked under her weight. For a long time, neither spoke. Grant's breathing grew steady, a low rhythm that matched the pop of the fire. Evelyn listened to it, let it pull her out of the dark places her mind kept trying to return to. She thought about the sound of the wagon wheels, the rope burns still red at her wrists, the faces that had laughed and looked away. She didn't understand the man sitting a few feet away, the quiet one who'd stepped out of shadow and undone her bindings without a word. He hadn't asked her name. She hadn't asked his. But something about the silence between them wasn't hollow. It had shape. Outside, the rain began again, light against the roof. The rhythm of it joined the fire, soft and steady. Grant leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed. He didn't mean to sleep, but weariness had its way. Before his lids fell, he caught sight of her again, curled small under the blanket, her hand tucked beneath her chin. Her face looked younger there, stripped of fear for the first time since he'd seen her. He let his head rest against the wood, rest against him. The warmth from the stove reached him faintly, enough to ease the ache in his shoulders. His thoughts drifted. He remembered the last time someone else had shared this cabin. The sound of laughter that used to fill it. The small shoes by the door that had stayed long after their owner didn't. He swallowed hard and pushed the memory away. The way a man learns to push away too many ghosts. The fire cracked again, throwing a spark onto the floorboards. He nudged it back into the hearth with his boot. A long time passed before Evelyn spoke again. Her voice came through the dark like something afraid to break the quiet. "Why'd you do it?" He didn't open his eyes. Didn't think about it. "That's not an answer." "No," he said softly. "It ain't." There was no edge in his tone, no defense, just truth, stripped bare. Evelyn stared at the ceiling. She wanted to ask more, but the pull of exhaustion was stronger. Her eyes drifted closed. The sound of the rain became a lullaby. The fire, a heartbeat. Grant stayed awake longer, watched the flame grow smaller. The air in the room felt warmer now, less empty. Outside, the wind carried the smell of wet earth and pine. Somewhere up the ridge, a wolf called a long, mournful note that faded into silence. Grant looked toward the window, the faint glow of dawn just beginning to stain the clouds. He exhaled, slow. The world out there hadn't changed, but inside the cabin, something subtle had shifted. He didn't name it. He didn't need to. Morning crept softly into the valley, thin light slipping through the cracks, between the boards, and pooling on the wooden floor. The air still held the chill of night. Smoke from the dying fire coiled lazily toward the rafters, and from somewhere near the stove came the quiet, steady sound of water beginning to boil. Evelyn woke to that sound, the hiss, the pop of wood, and the faint smell of coffee. For a moment, she didn't move. The blanket felt heavy around her shoulders, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, there was no rope biting into her skin. Her wrists were free. She turned her head slightly. Grant was standing by the stove, sleeves rolled to his elbows, eyes half on the fire. His movements were slow, practiced. He poured a thin stream of water from the kettle into a small tin pot, then added a handful of coffee grounds. The smell filled the room, sharp and comforting. "Morning," he said without turning. Evelyn blinked at the light sneaking through the small window. Dust motes drifted in it, dancing in the air like tiny sparks. She wasn't sure how to answer. The word felt foreign on her tongue. He glanced over his shoulder. "There's bread on the table," he said, "and salt, just that. No more." Evelyn sat up slowly. Her muscles ached from the ride, from the cold, from everything before. She pulled her hair back with her fingers, the strands rough from dirt and sleep. The bed creaked beneath her, and the sound seemed too loud in the quiet. She looked around the room, the plain walls, the single window, the rifle resting against the corner. Everything here spoke of solitude. Even the air seemed used to being left alone. Grant poured coffee into 2 tin cups. The steam rose between them, like breath. He set one down on the table and took a seat on the edge of the stool across from it. Evelyn hesitated before standing. Her bare feet met the cool floorboards, and she moved carefully, as if the world might shift under her. When she reached the table, she sat opposite him, eyes on the cup. The smell reminded her of mornings, long before all this, before debt and shame and the long road of being someone's possession. Her father had drunk coffee like this, bitter and thin. Each swallow followed by silence. She wrapped her hands around the cup. The metal was warm, almost too warm. Grant tore a piece of bread and pushed it toward her. "Eat," he said. Her stomach twisted not from hunger, but from not knowing if she could accept it. Then she nodded once, almost to herself, and took the piece. It was stale, but soft enough to chew. The salt, she noticed, was coarse and white, the kind that tasted of wind and rock. They ate without sound. The only noise came from the crackle of fire and the horse shifting outside the window. After a while, Grant leaned back slightly, elbows on his knees. "You sleep all right?" Evelyn looked at him. His face was half in shadow, the scar on his cheek catching the faintest bit of light. "I did," she said quietly. Then, after a pause, "Thank you." He nodded once, as if the word didn't require an answer. Outside, a bird called sharp and lonely, echoing through the pines. The sound carried into the room and settled between them. Evelyn glanced around again, noticing the small things she hadn't before: a pair of boots near the door, polished but worn thin at the soles, a folded blanket on a chair, a tin can with a few nails inside. The life of a man who spoke little, but survived one day after another. She thought of asking how long he'd lived here, where he'd come from, but she didn't. The air felt fragile, as though too much talking might crack it. Grant took another sip of coffee, then stood and stepped toward the door. The morning light hit his back, washing him in a faint gold. "I'll see to the horse," he said. Evelyn watched him go. The door closed behind him, leaving the room quieter still. She breathed out slowly, feeling the sound of her own exhale for the first time in days. She rose and moved toward the window. Outside, the valley spread wide, ringed with hills that caught the light like silver. Grant was at the trough, filling it with water. His movements were deliberate, efficient. There was no impatience, no wasted motion. The wind lifted her hair as it slipped through the cracks of the frame. She touched the edge of the kerchief, still tied around her wrist. The skin beneath it had started to heal. Pale lines where the rope had once burned deep. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath until she let it go. When Grant came back in, he carried the smell of morning. On his coat wood, smoke, and the faint sweetness of pine. He hung his hat by the door, then crouched to check the stove. "You can stay," he said suddenly. Evelyn turned. "What?" He didn't look up. "Until you figure what comes next." She didn't answer right away. The offer sat heavy in the air. Part of her wanted to believe it. The other part had forgotten how. "Finally," she said. "Why?" He straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans. "Because it's cold out there," he said simply. "And because I don't want to see anyone else tied up in a barn." There was no weight of virtue in his tone. No pity either, just truth. Evelyn looked down, fingers tightening around the coffee cup. She wanted to tell him she didn't need his kindness, that she could take care of herself, but even that would have been a lie. Grant walked to the door again, opened it just enough to let the light spill in. Dust swirled in the beam, golden and soft. "You can rest," he said, his voice low. "Or you can help me cut wood when you're ready." He stepped outside, the door closed. For a long while, Evelyn just stood there. The fire popped, a log fell inward, sparks rising before fading to ash. She looked around the room again, the simplicity of it, the quiet. It was the first place in years where she didn't feel watched. The blanket still held the shape of her body from the night before, the chair by the table still warm where he'd sat. She sat back down, staring at the steam rising from the coffee. Through the window, she could see him working near the shed, splitting logs, each swing clean and sure. The sound echoed across the valley, steady as a heartbeat. She didn't know what this place was to her, yet a shelter, a pause, a trick of fate. But something in her chest loosened, just slightly. The morning sun climbed higher, spilling across the floorboards, warming the dust in the air, for the first time in a long while. Evelyn Hart felt something like safety. She didn't name it, didn't trust it, but she let it stay. Outside, Grant raised his axe again, the blade catching light as it came down. Inside, she breathed easier. The mornings came quiet in that valley, cold air seeping through the cracks, firelight painting slow gold across the cabin walls. Days stretched without hurry, each one blending into the next, soft as dust over the trail. Evelyn began to learn the rhythm of the place, the sound of the axe, splitting wood at dawn, the hiss of coffee on the stove, the silence that followed after. Grant didn't talk much. He didn't need to. The way he moved steady, unshaken, spoke enough. He'd rise before first light, check the horse, mend the fence. His world was built on habit, on doing what needed doing, and nothing more. Evelyn kept to the cabin those first days, her body still remembering fear the way a scar remembers the wound. She swept the floor, washed the tin cups, folded the blankets even when he hadn't asked her to. She wasn't sure if it was gratitude or instinct, keeping her hands busy so her thoughts didn't wander back to places darker than this valley. Sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, she watched him from the window, how the sun caught the edge of his hair, how he paused between swings of the axe, hands on the handle, breathing slow as though measuring each moment. There was a weariness to him that wasn't just tired bones, something deeper, something that stayed behind the eyes. By the third morning, the air had turned warmer. She stepped outside with a bucket to fetch water from the trough. The light on the ridge was thin, silvered by fog. Grant was crouched by the fence line, hammering a nail into a loose board. He looked up when he heard her boots on the dirt, nodded once, then went back to work. She filled the bucket and started back, but her gaze lingered on him. There was a faint limp in his step she hadn't noticed before, small but constant, like a memory that refused to fade. Inside, she poured the water into the pot, lit the stove. The smell of smoke began to fill the cabin again, mixing with pine and damp earth. She sat by the window, the mug warm in her hands, and listened. The valley had its own kind of music, the scrape of metal, the wind moving through the grass, the call of a hawk circling somewhere unseen. Grant came in just before noon, wiping his hands on a rag. His shirt was damp with sweat, streaked with sawdust. He set his hat on the peg and poured himself a drink from the jug by the door. "You work early," she said, her voice careful, unsure if conversation was something allowed here. He shrugged, eyes still on the table. "Old habits," he said. Evelyn studied him a moment. "From the war?" He looked up then. Surprised, she knew. "You can tell?" She nodded. "You move like someone who's still listening for gunfire." He didn't answer, just took another sip and stared into the cup, like the bottom of it held a place he hadn't visited in years. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire cracked softly, filling the space between them. Evelyn traced the rim of her mug with her thumb. "My father sold me," she said finally. her voice steady but quiet. He owed men money. Said I'd square the debt. Grant's hand stilled. I thought maybe it was the kind of thing that only happened to other people, she went on. Turns out, it happens to anyone desperate enough. He said nothing, but she could see the muscle in his jaw tighten. After a long pause, he spoke. My brother, he said. He was 12. We were headed west, near the border. Raiders came through the pass. I was too far ahead. His voice lowered. I came back to smoke and silence. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her cup. She didn't look at him. Didn't need to. The fire made a soft popping sound. For a while, that was all there was, the small noises of two people remembering what they couldn't change. Then Grant stood, moving to stir the pot on the stove. You want stew. She blinked at him, almost startled by the simplicity of it. Yes, she said. He nodded, ladled it into 2 bowls, and set one in front of her. They ate slow, neither tasting much, but the act itself felt like something sacred to souls who'd lived too long on pain-finding. For once, something warm. Outside, the wind picked up. The boards of the cabin creaked softly, the way wood does when it remembers every season it survived. After they finished, Grant stepped to the window, looking out toward the ridge. Storm coming, he said. Evelyn joined him, standing a few feet away. The horizon had gone dark at the edges, clouds rolling in low and mean. The air smelled of rain and iron. How long have you been here? She asked. He thought for a second. 3 winters, he said. Maybe 4. Don't count much anymore. And before that, he shook his head. Before that doesn't fit anywhere. She understood that more than she wanted to. The first drops of rain hit the roof, slow and heavy. He reached over, checked the latch on the door. Evelyn moved to gather the dry wood, adding a few more logs to the fire. The flames caught quick, throwing light across their faces. Grant sat back down, the chair creaking beneath him. She followed his gaze to the rifle in the corner, its barrel glinting faintly in the firelight. Do you ever think of leaving? She asked quietly. He took a long breath. Thought about it, he said. Then the thinking stopped mattering. She looked at him, eyes soft. Because there's nowhere to go. He met her gaze. Because some places follow you, even when you leave. The rain thickened, drumming steady against the roof. Evelyn sat down across from him again, her hands folded in her lap. The warmth from the fire reached her skin, chasing away the chill that had lived there too long. Neither spoke after that. But something in the quiet shifted. The distance between them, built from loss and caution, didn't feel so wide anymore. When the wind howled through the cracks, Grant rose to check the shutters. Evelyn followed, holding the lantern to help him see. Their shoulders brushed once, barely, but enough to send a small current through the room. He looked at her, only for a second. She held his gaze this time, no fear, just understanding. He nodded, then fastened the latch. That'll hold, he said. She smiled faintly. You say that like you've done this 100 times. Maybe I have. The rain softened again, tapering into a steady whisper. The valley outside disappeared behind a thin veil of mist. Grant sat by the fire once more, his hands open over the warmth. Evelyn joined him. For the first time since she'd arrived, she wasn't thinking of leaving. The silence between them felt different now, not the emptiness of strangers, but the kind that let 2 broken things rest side by side without needing to be fixed. The firelight flickered across their faces, soft and uneven. Outside, the storm moved on, leaving the scent of rain behind. Inside, two people sat together, both marked by what they'd lost, both beginning without words to understand what it meant to be seen. Grant stared into the embers until his eyes blurred, then glanced toward her one last time. Evelyn met his look, calm and quiet, and somewhere in that space between breath and silence, between what had been and what might be, something began to heal. Morning light drifted through the window, soft as breath. Dust floated in it, turning slow circles before settling on the table. The fire from last night had burned down to a quiet orange core, but the cabin still held its warmth. Outside, a woodpecker worked at a pine trunk somewhere up the slope, each tap echoing steady as a heartbeat. Evelyn stood near the stove, sweeping ash into a small tin pan. The sound of bristles against wood was gentle, rhythmic. She moved without hurry, without fear, just the calm of someone who had begun to belong somewhere, even if she didn't know it yet. Grant was outside splitting logs, his axe rising and falling in a slow, practiced arc. The air carried the scent of resin and smoke, now and then. The crack of wood rang out and faded into the valley. Evelyn paused, listening. The rhythm of his work had become a kind of measure for the day. She set the pan aside, straightened, and looked around the cabin. She'd taken to putting things in order, not because he'd asked her to, but because it made the silence easier to live in. The broom leaned against the wall, the dishes washed and stacked, her hands, once used, only to shield, now found purpose in small, ordinary things. Grant came in when the sun had climbed halfway up the ridge. He left his boots at the door, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Wind's shifting, he said. Might be rain by dusk. She nodded, glancing toward the hills. It smells like it. He poured water from the jug into a cup, drank, then set it down. The table between them had become their meeting place, neutral ground. Words came slowly there. But they came. Evelyn pulled her mending basket from the shelf. She sat near the window, thread between her fingers, fixing a tear along one of Grant's shirts. He watched her a moment. "Didn't ask you to do that," he said. She smiled faintly. "I know." Her stitches were small, careful. Years of patching what little she'd owned had given her hands that steadiness. Grant turned away, but his eyes softened. There was something about watching someone tend to what you've long stopped caring for. It makes you remember you could care again. Outside, clouds began to drift in, slow and gray. The light dimmed a little. The cabin felt smaller, but not in a way that pressed, more like the world had folded around them for a while. Grant set to sharpening his knife at the table. The steady rasp of metal against stone filled the space between them. It was an honest sound, no edge of threat, just the work of keeping something ready. After a long while, he spoke. "You never told me your name?" Evelyn looked up from her stitching. The question caught her off guard. "It's Evelyn," she said softly. He nodded once, as though testing the shape of it. "Evelyn," he repeated, quiet, like a word that carried weight. Then he added, "Grant." Their eyes met across the table. Nothing else needed saying. Between those two names hung a silence that wasn't empty anymore. It held acknowledgement, one soul recognizing another. The rain began in light drops, tapping against the roof. Evelyn leaned her head toward the window, watching the streaks gather and run down the glass. Grant got up, checked the door latch, and stoked the fire higher. She spoke without turning. "How long has it been since you said your name out loud?" He hesitated, hand resting on the poker. "Long enough that it sounds strange," he said. She smiled, though he couldn't see it. "It suits you." The firelight flickered against his face, softening the lines cut deep by years of solitude. He sat back down. "Can't say the same for myself." "You don't have to," she said simply. "You're here." He looked at her then, really looked. And for the first time since she'd come, something like ease crossed his features. The rain grew heavier, drumming steady on the roof. The sound filled every corner, smoothing away the edges of the silence. Evelyn set the mending aside, watching the flames shift and dance. "It's strange," she murmured. "How quiet can feel safe." Grant leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Quiet can be anything you let it," he said. "Safe or lonely." She nodded. "I think it depends who's listening." He said nothing to that, but his eyes stayed on her a little longer before drifting back to the fire. Time moved slow after that. She boiled potatoes for supper, while he stacked wood by the stove. When he reached past her to hang his coat, his sleeve brushed her shoulder. Neither stepped back. The touch was brief, but real like the warmth of sunlight through a passing cloud. They ate by lamplight when evening came, 2 bowls between them, steam rising into the dim air. Evelyn broke a piece of bread, passed it across the table. Grant took it, their fingers almost touching. "Thank you," he said. She smiled. "You already gave me a place to stay. Seems fair." Outside, thunder rolled far off across the hills, deep and slow. The cabin creaked in reply. Evelyn glanced toward the sound, but it didn't stir fear in her, only memory. After the meal, she cleaned the bowls and hung them by the window. Grant sat by the fire, the glow painting him in soft amber. He lit his pipe, drew once, exhaled the smoke in a thin curl that caught the light. "You mind if I sit?" she asked. He shook his head. She settled on the floor beside the hearth, her knees drawn close, palms open to the heat. The fire cracked, sparks climbing up the chimney. They sat like that for a long while, 2 figures framed by quiet, the kind of quiet that heals more than words ever could. Outside, the rain began to fade, leaving only the soft drip from the eaves. Evelyn leaned her head against the wall, eyelids heavy. "Feels like the world's further away here," she said. Grant's voice came low, almost a whisper. "Maybe that's the point." Her eyes closed, but she smiled. "Then maybe I'll stay until it finds me again." He didn't answer, but a faint nod passed through him. The firelight thinned, turning from gold to ember red. The smell of wet pine drifted in through the cracks, sweet and earthy. In that fading glow, 2 names hung in the quiet air. Evelyn and Grant, and the silence between them was no longer the distance of strangers. It was something gentler, something alive. Outside, the rain stopped. The night settled over the cabin, calm and whole. And somewhere beneath that calm, where memory used to ache, trust began to root itself in the soil of their stillness. The wind came down from the ridge that night, long and hollow, carrying the sound of dry grass brushing against itself. The fire had burned low, only coals left glowing under the grate, their light crawling slow across the cabin walls. Evelyn sat near the window, wrapped in a blanket, listening. The world outside was nothing but darkness and wind. Grant was by the stove, carving something small from a piece of wood. His knife moved in short, careful strokes. The faint rasp of it was the only sound between them. Evelyn turned her head, eyes catching the faint shine of the blade. "You ever think they'll come looking?" she asked. The knife stopped midair. Grant didn't look up. "Who them?" she said. "The men from Silver Creek. The ones who—" Her voice faltered, the rest of the thought sinking back into her chest. Grant wiped the knife clean on his sleeve, set the wood down. "No," he said simply. She frowned. "You sound sure." He leaned back in his chair. "Because men like that don't look back," he said. "Once they've taken what they wanted, the rest doesn't exist. To them, you're gone." Evelyn's hands tightened around the blanket. The words hung heavy in the air, heavier than she expected. "Gone," she repeated, quieter this time. "You mean forgotten." Grant looked toward the window, where the firelight touched the edge of her face. That's another word for it. The wind pressed against the walls, a long sigh through the boards. For a while, neither spoke. Evelyn stared into the dark outside, her reflection faint in the glass eyes she barely recognized, the ghost of herself looking back. She thought of Silver Creek, the barn, the rope, the laughter, the smell of sweat and liquor, the faces she tried to forget, but never could. To them, she really was gone, a name lost under a joke, a story told between drinks. And yet here she was, breathing, alive, in a cabin that shouldn't have existed in her world. The fire popped softly. Grant rose, added a log, stirred the coals until sparks lifted into the chimney. The room brightened a little, enough for Evelyn to see the lines carved into his face, the wear that wasn't just age, but the memory of too many losses. "You don't miss them," she said, not sure if she was asking or assuming. He paused. Whoever you left behind." His hand stilled on the poker. For a moment, the only sound was the slow rise and fall of the fire. Then, "Finally," he said, "I used to—" He sat back down, elbows resting on his knees. "After my brother, there wasn't much left to go back to. Folks I knew had either moved on or turned to ghosts. Sometimes I think about riding back east, but I wouldn't know the faces there anymore, wouldn't know the streets. Maybe they wouldn't know me either." His voice had gone low, almost a whisper, so I stopped missing things. Seemed easier that way. Evelyn studied him in the glow of the fire. The scar on his cheek looked softer tonight. "Not so sharp against his skin," she said quietly. "You talk like someone who buried himself before he died." Grant gave a small, tired smile. "Maybe I did." The words sat between them, gentle but unshakable. She drew the blanket closer, her eyes falling to the small wooden shape he'd been carving. It was rough but familiar. A tiny horse, its legs uneven, its mane barely defined. She reached toward it, but stopped just short. "You made that for someone." He looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. "Used to carve them for my brother. Little ones." He'd lined them up on the windowsill. Evelyn didn't move her hand. "You can still hear him, can't you?" Grant's jaw tightened. "Sometimes when the wind comes through the ridge like that." They sat there, both listening. The wind whistled low, long, fading into nothing. "I used to hear my father's voice," Evelyn said after a while. "Even after he was gone, not kind, not cruel. Just there, reminding me what I owed." Grant's gaze shifted toward her, quiet and steady. "And what do you owe now?" She took a breath, the kind that trembles before it finds strength. "Nothing," she said. "And maybe that's the hardest part." He nodded, as if he understood exactly. Outside, a coyote howled far off, its cry carried by the wind across the valley. The sound echoed through the hollow of the hills before disappearing. Evelyn looked toward the door, her heart thudding once, then easing again. Still feels like they could come, she said softly. Those men, that life. Grant stood, walked to the window, and looked out. The night was deep and empty. They won't, he said. You can't know that? He turned to her, eyes calm. I do. Because people like them never think about what they've thrown away. And you? He paused, choosing his words with care. You're not something that can be found once you've decided to start over. Her breath caught at that. The firelight flickered between them, throwing shadows on the walls. Evelyn felt something shift slow and small, but real. The kind of change that doesn't make noise, just quietly rearranges what's left inside you. She rose from her chair, moved closer to the fire. And you, she asked, have you started over? Grant looked into the flames, the glow catching the faint lines of his face. Don't think a man like me ever does. He said, we just keep walking till the trail runs out. She watched him for a moment, then bent down and picked up the small wooden horse. She set it on the mantel above the fire, where the light touched it, just enough to make it shine. Then maybe, she said softly, you can stop walking for a while. He looked at her, eyes unreadable, but there was something new there, a quiet understanding, maybe even gratitude. Maybe, he said. The wind outside softened, its edge dulling into a whisper. The flames crackled low, throwing orange light that danced across the floorboards. Evelyn sat back down, her gaze on the little horse. For the first time, it didn't remind her of what had been taken, but of what could still grow in the ruins of what was lost. She didn't know if the past would ever stop haunting her, but in that cabin, with the sound of the wind turning gentle and the warmth of the fire brushing her skin, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in years. Peace. Fragile, but real. Grant poured water over the dying embers, the hiss filling the silence like a soft sigh. He looked at her once more before turning toward the door. Get some rest, he said. She nodded, eyes still on the small wooden figure. Good night, Grant. He paused at the threshold, the lamplight cutting his outline in gold. Good night, Evelyn. When the door closed, she was left with the quiet, the wind, and that small carving glowing faintly above the fire. She reached out, fingertips brushing its edge. Forgotten, she thought, but still here, and that, somehow, was enough. The sun rose slow over the ridge, light spilling through the fog like gold through milk. The valley woke with small sounds, the creak of wood, the shift of a horse in its stall, the faint whistle of wind through the cracks. In that hush, Evelyn stepped outside, her bare feet pressing into the cool dirt. The air was sharp, clean, filled with the scent of pine and smoke. For a long moment, she just stood there, breathing. Inside the cabin, Grant's axe rang out, steady and sure. Each swing carried the same rhythm, measured, patient, without hurry. Evelyn watched him for a while from the porch, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. There was a quiet beauty in his focus, in the way he met the world with silence instead of force. She'd started to help more, though Grant never asked. The first time she tried, she burned her fingers on the stove handle. He didn't say a word, just filled a basin with cold water and left it by her side. The next day, she was more careful. Now, the work came easy, fetching water, mending seams, stirring the pot of stew until the smell filled the house. Small things, but they made the hours whole. Sometimes they talked, not often, not deeply. A few words about weather, wood, or the horse. But the silences between had softened, no longer a wall, more like a breath they shared. By the third week, Evelyn began venturing past the fence. She followed the slope behind the cabin to where the grass turned wild and the rocks warmed under the sun. There, she'd stand still and let the wind move her hair, eyes closed. The air didn't taste of fear anymore. One afternoon, while she was washing clothes by the stream, Grant came down the trail. His boots sank into the wet soil, leaving shallow prints. He crouched beside her, dipped his hands into the water. "Flows stronger after rain," he said. She nodded, wringing out his shirt. "You always come down here sometimes." He looked toward the far hills. "Reminds me I'm still part of something living." The words lingered in the air, like the ripple on the surface. She looked at him, at the way the sunlight caught the gray near his temples. "I think I'm just learning that," she said. He gave a faint nod. "Takes time." They didn't speak again for a while. The water ran cool between their hands, carrying away the dirt, the past, the weight of all that couldn't be said. When they walked back, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and rain. Evelyn felt her skirt brush against her legs, felt the ground solid beneath her feet. Every step was her own now. No one told her when to move, when to stop. The freedom of it was small, almost invisible, but it filled her chest like breath after being underwater too long. Back at the cabin, Grant mended the fence, hammering new boards in place. She watched from the porch, the late sun glinting off the nails, the steady sound of each strike like a heartbeat. When he finished, he leaned the hammer against the post, looked toward her. "You keep the place cleaner than I ever did," he said. Evelyn smiled. Maybe it needed a woman's hand. He smirked faintly, tugged at his glove. Maybe. The evening settled around them, gentle and cool. Inside, she lit the lamp and ladled stew into 2 bowls. Grant washed up at the basin, the water dark with dust and iron. When he sat across from her, they ate slow, each mouthful unhurried. Halfway through, Evelyn looked up. "You ever think about leaving?" Grant wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Used to." And now he shook his head. "Now I think about staying alive. That's enough." She traced the edge of her bowl. "Sometimes, I wonder if I even know what that means." He met her eyes. "You're learning." His tone wasn't kind or cold. It was simple, steady, as though it were fact. Later, as dusk bled into night, the air cooled and the fire's glow turned amber. Evelyn sat by the window, needle in hand, patching one of his shirts. The sound of the thread pulling through cloth was the only thing breaking the quiet. Grant sat near the door, whittling another small horse from pine wood. When he finished, he set it on the table beside the first one, 2 now, side by side. Evelyn looked up from her sewing. Another. He nodded. Didn't seem right. Just the one. She smiled, small and genuine. "It's better this way." He looked at her then, the firelight catching in his eyes. Something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, respect, maybe something softer beginning to take root. Outside, the night grew still. Coyotes called somewhere far off, their voices thin in the wind. Evelyn set her needle down, folded the shirt carefully, and spoke in a voice barely louder than the fire's crackle. "If I stay," she said, "it'll be because I choose to." Grant didn't move. didn't look away. After a long moment, he nodded once. Slow. And I'll respect that, he said. The words settled like dust after a storm quiet, final, but alive. Evelyn felt them land somewhere deep, where her old fear used to live. The fire hissed, throwing a small spark up the chimney. Grant leaned back, arms crossed loosely. Choice is a hard thing to carry, he said. Evelyn smiled faintly. Then I'll learn to hold it. For a while, they sat like that, the sound of the wind slipping through the valley, the two carved horses watching over the room. Grant stood, checking the latch on the door before banking the fire. When he turned, he saw her still by the window, her profile soft against the glow. Get some rest, he said gently. She nodded, but didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on the dark outside, where the stars had just begun to scatter across the sky. Grant, she said after a moment. He paused. Yeah, thank you. For letting me stay. He gave a half smile that almost reached his eyes. You don't owe me thanks, he said. Just keep breathing. The way he said it, quiet, certain sounded less like advice and more like a benediction. When he closed the door to his room, Evelyn sat a little longer, listening to the wind, the fire, the steady rhythm of her own breath. For the first time, it didn't catch in her chest. It came easy. She touched the small horse on the table, running her fingers along its rough mane. Then she whispered to herself, almost afraid to break the stillness, I'm free. And for once, the words didn't feel like something stolen. They felt earned. The fire dimmed, its glow soft as a heartbeat. Outside, the hills slept under a sky full of stars. Inside, Evelyn Hart once, a name whispered in fear breathed steady, slow, like someone learning to live again. The first snow came at dusk, silent, slow, like ashes from a fire that had burned too long. By nightfall, the world outside the cabin was white and still, a hush deep enough to swallow the sound of breath. The wind came after sharp, unkind, dragging through the cracks in the walls. It rattled the shutters, moaned in the chimney. Inside, the fire glowed low, fighting to keep its color. Grant stacked the last of the wood beside the stove, his hands red from the cold. Evelyn sat near the hearth, rubbing her palms together, watching the flames rise and fall. The smell of pine sap and smoke filled the air. Every few minutes, the wind slammed against the door hard enough to make the latch quiver. He looked toward the single bed by the far wall, rough frame, wool blanket, one pillow, temperatures dropping fast. He said quietly, You'll freeze if you stay on the floor. Evelyn didn't turn. I'll manage. He hesitated, jaw tight. The bed's big enough for two. That made her glance up. The firelight caught the edge of her face, wary, hard. You try anything I don't want, she said evenly. And I'll make sure you regret it. Grant didn't flinch. He just nodded once. Fair enough. They didn't speak again. When the fire burned low, he blew out the lamp. The cabin dimmed to amber and shadow. Evelyn stood, still clutching her blanket, and crossed to the bed. The boards creaked beneath her bare feet. Grant followed a moment later, moving slow, careful not to close the distance too much. He lay down first, his back to her, leaving half the mattress untouched. She slid under the covers, the wool coarse against her skin, her body still tense. Between them, a space wide enough to hold 100 memories neither dared speak. The wind howled outside, wrapping around the cabin like something alive. Evelyn listened to it until her heartbeat matched the rhythm. She turned her face toward the ceiling, The smell of smoke and cold earth filled her lungs. It wasn't comfort, but it wasn't fear either. Just a kind of tired acceptance, deep and quiet. Grant shifted once, pulling the blanket higher over his shoulder. You warm enough? He asked. Yes. Her voice was soft, but steady. He nodded into the dark. Good. The minutes stretched thin. Wood popped in the stove. Somewhere beneath the wind, a coyote called, its cry long and distant. Evelyn's hand rested outside the blanket, inches from his back. She could feel the heat radiating from him, steady as the fire. She closed her eyes. You always live this way, he answered after a pause. Don't know any other. You don't get lonely. He thought about it, sometimes. Then it passes. Her throat tightened. How? He let out a breath that almost sounded like a sigh. You get used to it, like cold water. For a while, neither moved. The cabin was all sound and heartbeat, the slow crack of the fire, the hush of snow piling on the roof. Evelyn's mind drifted to the places she'd been, the faces that blurred together like smoke, men with loud laughs and hollow eyes, nights without names. This quiet, heavy and pure, felt almost unbearable compared to that noise. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. I used to think I'd never feel safe again. Grant didn't answer right away. Then, maybe safe ain't the same as free. She opened her eyes. And which one do you have? He turned his head, slightly, not enough to meet her gaze. Neither. Most days. Something in his voice, rough, unguarded, unraveled a knot inside her. She wanted to say something kind, but the words caught in her throat, so she just breathed, slow and even, letting the silence hold them both. After a while, her muscles began to loosen. The heat from his body seeped into the cold between them. It wasn't closeness, not yet, just warmth, shared out of necessity. But it was enough to make the night a little less cruel. Grant lay still, eyes half open in the dark. He could hear her breathing, now soft, steady, not the quick, shallow rhythm of fear, the kind that comes when someone starts to trust the quiet again. He closed his eyes, listening. Time passed like snow, falling slow, silent, relentless. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost lost in the wind. You can sleep. I won't touch you. I know, she murmured, and she did. Somehow, she knew. The fire sank to embers, painting the room in a dull red glow. Shadows of their shapes wavered across the wall. Two outlines that didn't quite touch, but leaned toward each other, all the same. Evelyn turned slightly, facing his back. Grant, he made a small sound, half asleep. Yeah, thank you. He didn't open his eyes. Don't thank me. Just rest. Her lips curved faintly, invisible in the dark. Good night. He breathed out slow. Night. Evelyn. The wind outside softened. Snow fell heavier, muffling the world. Hours slipped by like that two souls beneath one blanket. Neither seeking, neither retreating, just existing in the fragile peace of shared warmth. Near dawn, when the fire had all but died, Grant stirred. The faintest light bled through the window, pale blue against the walls. Evelyn was still asleep, her hair a dark spill on the pillow, one hand half curled near his shoulder. He didn't move it away. He lay there for a while, listening to her breathing, steady and even, like the calm after a long storm. The kind of calm a man doesn't trust yet, but hopes to. Outside, the snow stopped falling. The valley was white, endless, untouched. Inside, The air held that rare stillness that comes after something has quietly changed. Grant turned his gaze toward the ceiling, eyes tracing the faint lines of frost spreading across the beams. Fair enough, he whispered again, a ghost of a smile at the edge of his mouth. Between them, the space that once felt wide as a canyon was now just a breath. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt truly alone. Morning came quiet, like breath through linen. The light crept slow across the cabin floor, soft and gold, touching the wooden walls that had held their silence through the long night. The fire was just embers now, but the air was still warm, filled with the smell of coffee and smoke. Evelyn stirred beneath the blanket, eyes opening to the sound of a spoon clinking gently against a tin. Grant stood by the stove, shoulders relaxed, hair mussed from sleep. The steam from the kettle rose around him like mist. He didn't look over when she sat up, and she didn't speak. Some mornings didn't need words. She watched him pour 2 cups, his hands steady. The coffee smelled strong, bitter, real. He set one down on the table, then leaned against the counter, letting the warmth seep into his palms. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, thin streams of water tracing lines down the window glass. Evelyn swung her legs off the bed, feet finding the cool floor. Her dress brushed against her ankles, the fabric worn soft. She walked slow, each step a whisper against the boards. When she reached the table, she sat, wrapping her hands around the tin mug. The heat bit her skin at first, but she didn't move away. They sat like that, facing the quiet together. The world outside was waking drips from the roof, a bird calling somewhere down the ridge, the groan of thawing earth. Grant took a sip, then spoke, his voice low. "Snow will be gone by noon." Evelyn nodded. "You'll start on the fence again." He smiled faintly. "If the ground gives." She looked out the window, eyes tracing the white fading into brown. "Everything looks different in the sun." Grant followed her gaze. Always does. "Just takes time to see it." A small silence fell between them. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind that lets a soul rest. Evelyn breathed in deep, the smell of coffee and pine reminding her of mornings she never had, ones that weren't marked by fear, or waiting, or the sound of boots behind her. This one felt new, not clean, but honest. Grant glanced toward her. Then, not with question or concern, but something gentler. Recognition, maybe? 2 people who'd stopped running, at least for now. Evelyn looked down at the coffee, the surface trembling slightly from her breath. "I used to wake up afraid of the day," she said quietly. "Didn't matter where I was. I'd open my eyes and wait for the wrong thing to happen." He didn't answer, only listened. "Today," she continued, "I didn't feel that. Not right away." Grant nodded once. "Slow. That's something." "It is," she said, and for the first time, she let herself smile. The light grew stronger, stretching across the room until it reached the small wooden horses on the shelf. Their shadows leaned against the wall, 2 figures side by side, carved from the same quiet. Grant turned toward the door. "When the ground's dry enough," he said, "we'll ride into town, get supplies. Maybe new shoes for the mare." Evelyn looked up, curious. "And after that," he shrugged, "after that, we come home." The word home lingered. It had a weight to it. She wasn't used to soft, but solid. She nodded slowly. "Home," she echoed. The sound of it between them felt right. For a while. They sat in easy silence, listening to the world change. The cabin creaked as it warmed, and the ice on the roof cracked, falling in soft bursts to the ground below. Evelyn traced her finger along the rim of her cup, feeling the rough edge where the metal had bent, imperfect. But it still held what it needed to. Grant reached for his coat, hanging by the door. He paused, glanced back at her. "You'll be all right here for a while." Evelyn smiled gently. "I've made it through worse." He nodded. "I know." She watched him step outside, the door groaning open, then shut with a thud. The cold rushed in for a heartbeat, then was gone. Through the small window, she saw him walk into the yard, breath clouding the air, his boots sinking into slush. He bent to check the trough, patted the horse's neck. Simple, necessary things. Evelyn leaned her head against the wall, eyes half closed, the warmth of the fire, the steady rhythm of his movements outside, the slow dripping of snow, it all folded into one quiet moment that felt, somehow, like forgiveness, not from anyone else, from life itself. She thought of what they'd both carried, the scars no one saw, the silences that used to hurt, to fill, and now, here they were. Two broken pieces that didn't quite fit the world, but somehow fit this morning. She stood and crossed to the window, pressing her palm to the glass. The sun had risen fully now, painting everything in pale gold. Grant looked up from the yard and caught her gaze through the light. He raised a hand in a small wave. She lifted hers back, just once. No words, no promises, just that. She turned then, moving to the table. The steam from her cup had faded, but she took another sip anyway. The taste was strong, grounding. Outside, the wind shifted, soft and warm. Somewhere far down the valley, the sound of melting snow became a stream again. Evelyn closed her eyes and let out a long, quiet breath, the kind that comes after years of holding too much inside. In that breath was everything what was taken, what was given back, what was finally left behind. She opened her eyes, looked toward the door, and whispered not to him, not to anyone, but to the world itself. "I'm still here." The words hung in the light for a moment, weightless and true. And then she smiled, faint but certain, as the sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the cabin walls and onto her hands, hands that once trembled, now steady, open, alive. The fire cracked softly, and the day went on. Sometimes, life doesn't hand us grand miracles. It gives us small chances to begin again. Evelyn and Grant didn't find salvation in words or promises, but in quiet acts of kindness, in shared silence, in learning to trust the morning light again. Their story reminds us that healing doesn't come from forgetting what hurt us, but from allowing gentleness to touch what's left behind. For those who have lived long enough to know loss, the kind that doesn't fade, there's comfort in this truth. Even broken people can build something steady, even in the coldest places. A warm meal, a respectful silence, a single act of decency. These are the bridges that carry us back to ourselves. Out on the plains, or within our own hearts, it's never too late to start over. Not to erase the past, but to live alongside it with peace, like snow melting into spring. Trust and tenderness can return quietly, without asking permission. And maybe that's what it means to survive, not by being untouched, but by choosing, again and again, to stay open to the light. Thank you for staying with us through this story, for listening, feeling, and remembering the quiet strength of the human heart. If this tale of the Old West touched something in you, if it reminded you of kindness, courage, or the simple grace of starting again, we'd be grateful if you'd let it live on a little longer. Please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Every time you do, you help keep these forgotten stories alive so the voices of the past can keep whispering their truth into the hearts of those who still listen. Until next time, may your nights be gentle and your mornings full of light.